In my previous video, I detailed James Shelby Downard's synchromystical read of the JFK assassination in King Kill 33. This spiraling scribe ultimately claimed to reveal a hidden occult significance in not only the events therein, but in other influential events that happened around that time, potentially kicking off the end times. Later in his life, Downard began writing an autobiography that attempted to explain his own personal life story in The Carnivals of Life and Death. This book was published by Feral House, which had previously published King Kill 33 in a collection of apocalyptic texts assembled by publisher Adam Parfrey called 𝐓𝐡𝐞. This is where many had first heard the name James Shelby Downard, with the secretive synchromystic sharing a book with the likes of hippie cult leaders, revolutionary nihilists, and a woman who insists that she's proud that she's a necrophiliac. I couldn't imagine Downard's reaction to these other writers. He no doubt would have thought these people were beyond the pale to a dark magic 33rd degree. Parfrey writes the introduction to this text and recounts meeting Downard personally while writing a piece on him for a book called Cult Rapture named Riding the Downardian Nightmare. Parfrey followed Downard in investigating various locations that Downard postulated may have dark mystical significance, following Downard's own logic to the discovery of caves underneath Kansas City that Downard believed hosted dark ceremonies. Downard believed caves had a huge significance to Freemasons for their naturally hidden and cavernous being, perfect for the concealment of evil acts in the name of monstrous spirits. Perhaps they were meeting up with the Darrow down there, the subterranean terrorists detailed in my first video? At one point, Downard showed Parfrey a photo of a beautiful woman and began to describe how this woman used to be his partner until she began drugging him with abulic and amnesiac drugs before leaving him to perform sex magic rituals with elite men, apparently playing the role of, quote, the great whore. Yep, this falling out sounds as messy as it was, with Parfrey surmising that perhaps the end of this close relationship informed Downard's paranoid worldview. Downard also personally revealed to Parfrey the disturbing lengths the sorcerers were going to in order to disrupt his life. This quote in particular makes it clear Downard truly believed the things he wrote about, no matter how outlandish they may seem. Here is Parfrey's quotation of Downard, but be forewarned, these details are lurid and graphic. I don't blame her for her nymphomania, they had her wired up. One day I found a wire sticking out of her ass. I pulled it out. It's a long, thin wire and connected to the end of it is some microelectronic contraption. It was to get her in a constant state of sexual excitation. They implanted me, too. Parfrey points out accurately that in Downard's writings, his subconscious seeps through and adds a psychosexual and almost primordial element to his examinations. He explains Downard's writings as a collision of the poetic against the logical, while sticking rigidly to its own deniable form of thinking that takes the mind to unpredictable places. He credits Downard with inspiring him to, quote, investigate the details and convergences of life. Parfrey's Feral House Publishing has published almost exclusively underground and transgressive works that explore the subjects most wish to keep out of sight and out of mind. Going into this book, I suspected things were going to be more straightforward and as a result lessen the veiled complexion of Downard. There are, after all, thinkers and eccentrics who are made more interesting in their obscurity, not to counter the whole point of this channel. Kicking off chapters with titles like The Snake Charmer and The Three Assassins and My Little Blue Alice Gowned and Golems, I was surprised by the audacious nature of Downard's alleged adventures. Misfortune, deception, and shocking events seemingly followed him everywhere as Freemasons looked to make a pharmakos out of Downard, just as they did with JFK, as explained in my last video. Before turning the age of 10, Downard was fighting off his mystical enemies with an arsenal consisting of a squirt gun, a brass key, sewing scissors, and kitchen matches. Reading about the resourceful Downard fighting off and fleeing from Ku Klux Klan attempted assassinations, occult brainwashers disguised as teachers, and sideshow magicians and his investigations into grand cover-ups of bizarre violent rites at such an early age made this track difficult to take seriously. It reminded me of the fact that Downard at one point was thought by some to be a made-up character created by Michael A. Hoffman II, William Grimstad, and Adam Parfrey, until author Adam Gorightly was able to substantiate this larger-than-life figure with his mailing address in Memphis, Tennessee, an obituary, and other concrete substantiations. As the book went on, I realized trying to figure out what was real, what was possibly mental illness, and what was Downard joking around was actually the funnest part of this book. You heard that correctly. Downard utilizes humor and satire in this book and defends his usage of such literary devices in the following quote from his introduction to the book. Some people may find the maelstrom of evil that surrounds us as too grave a matter to discuss in a satirical way. I offer this explanation for the jocose seriousness I occasionally employ. In a wake, truths are sometimes revealed in jest, and the melancholy of loss is overcome by drinking, feasting, and dancing around the corpse from whom all individuality has fled. The American establishment behaves like a possessed corpse, and thus my need to carry on its wake. Downard effectively takes the reader into his own paranoid worldview of esoteric evil and hidden threats, and admittedly it wasn't long until I began being suspicious of every person Downard crossed paths with. Yet Downard himself had no choice but to keep a cool head, forced to keep a few steps ahead of his antagonizers and even coming off as cool and suave in social situations. When asked what right he had to be at a juke joint to ask about a job at the age of 8, Downard shot back, "What right do you have to be here, and by what right do you ask?" With his squirt gun filled with cleaning fluid, Downard plays the role of a Lone Ranger, traveling through the dark primordial valley of the early 20th century, where factions like the Ku Klux Klan and Freemasons were in fact trying to expand their influence on society. The odd modus operandi I mentioned earlier of drugging and implanting biotelemetric implants is persistently repeated by the Freemasons throughout the text. Downard describes radiotelemetry as the science of automatic measurement and transmission of data via radio signals from remote sources. He also differs from the usual conspiracy theorists in that he insisted that the conspirators weren't a shadowy group of cigar-smoking Illuminati writing up works for world domination. He believed that different groups of occultists, Freemasons, businessmen, and even dark entities all competed for the largest piece of corrupting power, with this dangerously chaotic winner-takes-all competition, finding unknowing operatives and otherwise good people representing the interest of obscured evil. He called this almost incomprehensible, jittering Rubik's Cube of power flows the secret combination. Now let's move into the good stuff. Downard's weirdest claims. After moving to Chase, Florida, Downard claimed to have witnessed the concealment of large centipedes by dark magicians in cages connected to electrical devices. He even claimed that the centipedes established caretaker, the woman the dark magicians referred to as the Centipede Woman, had been brainwashed into believing her mind was half centipede already and that it would eventually turn full centipede. He wished to save this poor woman but was too freaked out by the massive amount of sorcerers and giant centipedes who were apparently ready to devour anyone who dared cross the creeps. Downard mentions the prevalence of weed plants in Dallas during the 1920s but abstains from this psychoactive plant. This isn't for health reasons, however, but because apparently its nature is, quote, hermaphroditic. Smoking marijuana apparently blends together the female and male sexual persona in people, and those who smoked too much of the funny stuff were at risk of becoming brainwashed hermaphrodites. On a bridge over the Trinity River, a site apparently picked for its esoteric significance, a tense standoff took place between Downard and the sorcerers, with one major disadvantage on Downard's side. He didn't have a gun. The man sent to speak to Downard while the rest of the sorcerers stood at both ends of the bridge was Hollywood's first Western star, Tom Mix. Or so the stranger dressed in, quote, fancy cowboy clothing that was crudely padded to match Tom Mix's rugged build claimed. Thankfully, Downard was a huge fan of Mix and was able to tell that this wasn't really the celebrated silver screen star, but instead some kook, quote, high on dope that was pretending to be him. After the man threatens Downard with his pistol, the ever-ready Downard improvises with what he had on him: shotgun shells, a pipe, and a hammer. Downard loaded the shell into the pipe and smacked it with a hammer, which apparently made the shell blast out into the armed phony's chest. The man didn't fall from his wound, so Downard ran up and smacked him on his head with the hammer for good measure. Still, the weirdo was just wounded and not killed, so Downard made sure he was pushed off the bridge. Downard then turned to the crowd of odd, evil onlookers, who apparently hollered and ran away, no doubt annoyed that their ritual murder didn't go as planned. Following this event, the streets became unpopulated and quiet, something that often happens in the book after these types of confrontations, and goes to show just how many people may be initiates in the dark magic sects. Here's a quote from the book about what happened when the young Downard was forced to defend himself in court for the self-defense slaying of multiple Ku Klux Klanners. When I was taken to court, the judge informed me that there were witnesses who had seen me shoot the deceased Klansmen. "Did you shoot the men?" asked the judge. "I shoot bad men. They were bad men, and so I shot them," I replied. The judge asked me how I managed this feat, so I showed him my cap pistol and told him that I pointed it at one of the gunmen and exclaimed, "Bang, bang!" I then indicated that my playmate, who had accompanied me to the freight office, had shot more bad men than I did on the day before. My playmate spoke up and said that what I had related was true and that one of the bad men he had shot was worth 10 of the ones that I had shot and that I had said so myself. The court spectators had a good laugh at that. The judge then asked me how I knew these men were bad. My explanation to the judge centered on the fact that this trio had attempted to sodomize me and that one of them was involved in prostitution. After a truly confusing exchange with an occultist and snake charmer named Elu, Downard squirted him in the eyes with a water gun, let his abused snake free, and watched as the man was eaten by the massive snake. Downard then apparently kissed the snake after its meal, who either from the ecstasy of murdering its tormentor, the kiss from Downard, or the excitement of both, orgasmed. Even in the harshest conditions, Downard's strong will prevailed, as exemplified by this quote. "I lived in the manner of a feral child, scavenging and eating cattle droppings, helped only by a coyote and a snake. I remember riding a stick horse up onto one of the Tres Hermanas mountains that overlooked Columbus and imagining that I was the fifth horseman of the apocalypse, and cursing the evil people of that area and all others like them." In this quote, Downard details a neighbor from hell, a dark magician who sacrificed pigs in odd rituals. "One day I observed the man perform a bizarre ritual. Walking back and forth from the meat grinder to the javelina pen, he threatened and cursed the pigs, brandishing a pistol all the while, then walked over to the house we lived in and touched the water faucet, protruding from the side of the house. The ritual he was performing had to do with the belief that there is a magnetic field around human and animal bodies, a commonly held belief in witchcraft, Masonic sorcery, and the science of radiesthesia. Thus, he was performing a mystical charade by threatening and cursing the pigs and then walking over to touch our water faucet." Downard also claimed to receive 2 phone calls from sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who supposedly inquired about his ordeals and investigations. After the second phone call, Downard's residence was visited by secret agents who collected up strange artifacts and books that he kept dear as evidence of his ordeals. After this, he was gifted a gold ticket for $1 million. Wait now, this just sounds like a cheap way to not have any evidence for anything, and the gold ticket detail leaves us feeling foolish somewhere in the Wonka factory, right? Not so, as when Parfrey visited Downard, he was shown multiple examples of these golden tickets, and pointed out in his introduction that a quick Google search does in fact bring up golden tickets that represented large sums of gold, issued by the US government. Details like these keep you guessing, and when I found myself at the most confused I could become at the text, there was always these strange sections that popped up and made me feel like I was just being dismissive. Downard even has an excursion to Cuba in the last part of the book, at the insistency of US intelligence, whom he believes may assist him in taking out the evil sorcerers. No such luck. It was a setup. All of grand occult significance, of course, and Downard makes it out barely alive before insisting that the quote, Red Menace wasn't any harm at all, and that he was instead frightened by, quote, hired killers of a cabal and the US government. But this is too easy of a wrap-up. Downard suspected that the whole Cuban Revolution was an intelligence operation by the US-based agencies. Part of the reason why I enjoyed this text so much is that some of the major occurrences in Downard's works is a bombastic and mystical version of events and thoughts some people go through in life. Downard's tribulations of finding himself, questioning given values and customs, and trying to live in the presence of the darker side of the human experience are expressed as boldly as they feel, with Downard being the guardedly trusted scout through these deep depths, rushing to decode the mystery of dark happenings only to reveal an immortal truth of human wants and needs. He didn't have a teacher who was particularly harsh on him. He had a sorcerer in disguise trying to force him into slavery for the Freemasons. It wasn't that his paranoid mindset alienated his wife to the point of divorce. She was instead captured by Freemasons and forced to play the role of the Whore of Babylon in creepy sex magic rituals. Unfortunately, this riveting book didn't get the ending it deserved. Downard sadly passed away before he was able to complete it. It's been a blast reading through Downard's stuff, and as I said before, I think he's very much overlooked and deserves to be read by a wider audience. Downard's writings can be clunky and too tangential. In truth, there's parts of this text that I still don't understand. Still, I find him a compelling writer, one that certainly benefits from an editor, but he does truly create his own mystical flow that does in fact affect your thinking for a while after reading, just as great works of literature linger with you for days afterwards. As Richard Metzger, co-creator of disinfo.com, states on the back of the book, Downard makes an art form out of paranoia itself. He's an effective and fun shock to the belief system, and he makes you question the baseline of accepted facts of even the nature of reality itself. So that's what I have on Downard. I appreciate you checking out the video, and if you haven't seen part 1 of this series, I'll link it in the description below. My next video will cover which is basically an all-encompassing border science that gives a cosmological and indeed spiritual view of the world that is different from anything I've ever encountered. So until then, I appreciate you watching, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and have a great day.